Hi, and welcome to Conversations to Connect. I'm Fenella Hawksley, and on this podcast we will be hosting conversations to share insights, research and knowledge to inspire change and to help people feel more connected. On today's episode, I'm joined by Seth D. Kaplan, a leading expert on fragile states, societies, and communities. Seth is the author of Fragile Neighbourhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. He is a Professorial Lecturer in the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Senior Advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions, and consultant to multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, US State Department, US Agency for International Development, and OECD, as well as developing country governments and NGOs. Hi, Seth. Welcome to Conversations to Connect. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great pleasure, Fenella. Thrilled to be with you.
So my first question for you is, what would be the definition of a fragile state?
A fragile state can be defined in many ways. Many people look at what's wrong with it. Government doesn't work. There's violence. And so they define it by these symptoms or these problems. And then they look for technical solutions. Well, let's fix a ministry. The ministries don't work so well, and so on and so forth. I, on the other hand, look at what I would say are more foundational issues with those problems that you see as being products. And I would define a fragile state as lacking two ingredients that are required. One of them, at least you need at least one of them, and ideally both of them for a successful state. One is a certain level of cohesion, a sense of feeling of common destiny, that we are all in this together, and therefore people have a sense of obligation and like an overarching common identity with everyone else in the country, or the great majority, because sometimes it's never everybody, but the great majority. So one is the social, the relational. The second is the institutions. Ideally, you need institutions that are recognized by everybody, that brings people together and are able to help people cooperate. So if you have you have a sense of fraternity, togetherness, and you have the institutions that help you solve problems and move forward, you're going to do really well. If you have one or the other, you should be okay. If you have neither, it's a recipe for political instability and eventually violence.
And as someone who studied this for over 20 years, what was it that first interested you in this area, and how did you even get into working in fragile states?
I mean, I would say I did not have a master plan. Some people say I had this master plan. I was a wanderer. I was curious. I went to Istanbul as a student. I just fell in love with warmth. I come from the United States. I felt that my society was cold. I felt that my society sort of left me, I would say, a bit alienated, a bit disconnected. And so I was curious about the world. I had a chance to go between my sophomore and junior year for the summer to Istanbul, fell in love with the experience, even found a way to escape college early, to be very honest. And I just took off. By the time my classmates were finishing school, I was wandering around the Middle East.
Wow.
And then I was wandering around Africa, and I lived in Nigeria. And then I was wandering around Asia. I mean, if I had any master plan, the master plan was to try to see a little bit of everything. And so I literally was going continent by continent, trying to sample things. Meanwhile, always carrying, I mean, we're going a little bit pre-iPhone and stuff like that days, carrying books and buying books and reading about history, reading novels, studying what people said about these societies, just being curious. And I did homestays. I've done homestays in over 30 countries, if you can believe that. And nothing beats, if you want to know a country, you do a homestay, You try to wander across a broad swath of the territory. And ideally, you spend some time in some sort of offices because you also want to see how people work and interact with each other on some professional as well as personal level. And I would be doing this in different forms. And eventually, I needed to become a little serious about what I was doing. It's like a typical life pattern. So I first went into business and I tried doing business and I was okay for some years at that. But I said, this is boring. I mean, the people are very materialistic and I didn't want the money more than they did. So I actually had a business. I started a business in China, if you can believe that.
Wow.
And I had a whole staff. It's like really wandering here. So I ran a business in China. I lived in Japan. I lived in China. I had a business. I got to like whatever, let's say whatever 30 by then. It's a lot to do. I got rid of all this and I said, we're gonna be more practical. And this is already about 2005, whatever, 6. And we're basically, the world is worried about fragile states. That was a big topic. People were starting to talk about fragile states. And I was thinking about, I had studied all these countries, and the one topic that kept me up at night, I don't know, I always ask people, is there a topic that keeps you up at night? For me, the topic that kept me up at night from this wandering was, and the reading, a lot of reading always helps. Why do some countries work great and some countries don't? And you could define that in many ways, and there's different permutations, but I was just constantly asking myself that question. And then it so happened that it became important that people understood some of these countries better. And I was reading what people were writing, and I'm saying, this is nonsense. They don't know what they're talking about. And these are professionals, big think tanks, government people, and they're trying to, the United States and many countries were in Afghanistan then. There was stuff in the Middle East going on. And I had been in Africa and all these countries. And I said, there's a better way to think about these challenges. So I set off to write a book. Nobody knew me. I didn't work for anybody. I literally self-paid to go to Somalia, to go to Azerbaijan, to go to Bolivia. And I would write about these and I would publish my stuff. And then I had some design for a book. I wrote the book. It was the first book on fragile states. And I just kickstarted my whole career by taking that book, finding 200 people and mailing my book to all of them, and then just copying my way to such that people knew me and I'd publish. And so I don't recommend this career path for everybody. It's not a really normal career path. I was supporting myself by doing some business consulting on the side. So I know a bit about consulting.
Oh, no.
And sure enough, I'm giving you a bit of a long answer, but it so happened that people thought I knew what I was talking about. Surprise, surprise, because I'd actually learned things on the ground and not in a classroom. I live with families. I studied the societies, and mostly the experts. Sorry to say that there are people who really know a lot, but all of expert knowledge is in a classroom, in the 5-star hotel, in the central government offices, and it doesn't really understand the society. And what I was doing is, what is going on in society that matters, because I'm really interested in relationships. That's what attracted me. And so my approach was like this different approach. And that's how I got into the field. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's so interesting. Also interesting that you mentioned that you felt kind of disconnected, and like the society in America and the US can leave you feeling disconnected, but in Italy.
So disconnected. Yes, it's very easy. What I just love about these countries is you feel the warmth. You feel the warmth. You feel the sense of community. You feel the sense that something about relationships on a really basic level, we need to care for each other. We need to treat each other a certain way. And mostly here, it's very transactional. It's very superficial. And there are no relationships, actually. As long as I have my phone, I can hide in my cave and never know another person. And it's kind of sad that we can survive that way and be materially well off. That's not being human on some level. I really long for the warmth and the community.
So that's what I felt almost every time I came back from living somewhere else. Not coming back from Paris. But Coming back.
Paris is part of the north. If you went to Spain or Italy, you would feel
Yeah,
some of that
I
because
did.
it's like halfway. It's like
Mhm.
halfway. Southern Europe is like more communitarian. It's not quite the same, but it's like halfway there.
Coming back from Martinique, coming back from Mexico, I just missed like talking to people, going to the market and talking to people in the market, having friendships with people. Like in Brazil, I've just come back from Rio and I made friends with everybody on the street. So every time I walked down the street, I knew everyone's names. I'd go to the same shops. I'd have these relationships.
It's hard to imagine, Fenella, but this is how life was everywhere until not too long ago. I mean, we have to be honest. We're wealthier because our countries are more efficient. And so there is a positive side to that. The question is, what is the balance? What is the balance? We're materially well off and we're socially poor.
Yeah.
And is there a way to have both? And I actually believe there's a way to have both.
Yeah.
I just think we've been so focused on efficiency that we're socially disconnected and poor. And for many of us, we're not doing well because of it.
And that's the thing, materially, like if one of our intrinsic needs is human relationships and social contact, then yeah, we're lacking that. I also feel like it's the same, like in the supermarket in Martinique, it would take so long because everyone would have chats. Like the queue would take quite a long time, but you'd chat to people in the queue, you'd chat to people in the till. And in London, I'd come back and you just scan your items in silence on a screen. Yeah, it takes a lot less time, but you
even better. I ordered on the phone and it shows up, and that's there's a value to that. The question is, what happens if everything becomes like that? I almost feel like I can. I want to go meet someone, so I can put it on my phone. Who do I want to meet? And almost like in the future, what will happen? A robot will show up, and I'll have a drink with the robot. Well, that doesn't sound too appealing to me, but that's sort of the direction we're going in.
So do you think that the reason that we've gone this way is because of this quest for efficiency and technology? Like we use cars now to get to places so you don't meet people while you're walking on the way. I don't know. You use a screen and a phone to order food so you don't go to the supermarket, so you don't meet people that way. What do you think has led us to this crisis of disconnection?
I mean, there's many things. I think some of it is what you describe. I think there's certain things that we have done, and the United States is much worse than the United Kingdom, is that the way you can look at everything from how we've built the physical landscape to how we shop, to how we organize government. You can go through so many aspects of what is going on, and you can see that they're designed. I wouldn't say they're always designed for efficiency. They're maybe designed for material acquisition, or they're designed because of certain ideas about like urban planning, or designs about professionalization of problems and organizations. And there's a logic to it. So let's just take an example. Let's be practical. I happen to live in a flourishing neighborhood. One thing that makes it flourishing, there's many things, but I'm surrounded on three sides by green areas, and there's a center, and the center has some restaurants, a place to have coffee, a supermarket, and there's a bunch of local institutions. That helps it thrive. I can go 10 minutes away, a very typical American suburb, house, 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 house. There's no center, there's no beginning, there's no end. There's not a local school. People probably drive their kids to school. If you go worship in a church or whatever, house of worship, you're going to drive to that house of worship. There's nothing that brings you together. Maybe if you're in what we call a cul-de-sac, a dead end, you're going to have a few neighbors you'll know because that geography helps. But if you're just on a regular street, I mean, we make an effort to green the space. And we make an effort to have like dog parks. Well, dog parks help a little bit, but green paths to walk. I love walking on a few blocks from a green path, but that means I put my headphones on. I don't talk to anybody. We don't make an effort to create places where people gather. We don't make an effort to create institutions, community schools, local neighborhood schools, so important for promoting relationships between families, kids. Nonprofits, what were nonprofits in the past? They'd be very local. They'd be like something you would see in the favela. People would work with each other to help each other. There'd be some sort of informal organization. Some of it would be very ad hoc. Some of it would be more formalized. There'd be a whole mix, but there would be us helping us together. And a lot of things would be informal. You go over to your neighbor, can I have some sugar? Go over to your neighbor, can you watch my kids? Go over to your neighbor, whatever. I have a problem, whatever. Today, we have so little of that we're just alone. We're like on islands, and there's no institutions. There's no places to gather. There's no relationships to go to. It doesn't have to be quite like that. We could be, in my opinion, equally wealthy, but we could design a society that would nurture, especially these neighborhood relationships through many things that we do in society, from the physical to the institutional to the government. And I think in the past, we took all of this for granted. And now we have to be highly intentional, personally, but also as a society. And we are not. Therefore, we're losing it all.
It's true. We have to be intentional to create social interactions, whereas previously they would have just happened in daily life.
I mean, today it's maybe at your job, maybe
maybe
at your job, maybe not. You can live on an island and have a job. I mean, it's incredible. And there's a benefit to that. I mean, you could also go home and live. I know people that moved far from the coast to live near their family and live in a part of my country where they could have more community, yet they still work in a company that's far away. So I could see that being helpful from technology. But you also could do everything transactional and never be with another person. And that's crazy. And it explains why so many people are disconnected. People don't even want to go and get a job. People don't want to date. I'm sorry to say that. People don't want to get married. People don't want anything. They just want complete disconnection. Boy, that's not my universe. That's some other universe.
Even in London, I've had jobs in London where I'm working mostly 4 days of the week from home from a laptop. I've got friends who are doing that too. Like, you're in the center of the city, and no one's going into the office. So if you go into the office and there's not that many people there, you also
it's empty. It's empty.
Oh, why am I here? I should be at home. And efficiency. It's more efficient if I'm at home because I save 2 hours in commuting, so I'll work from home. But then it fuels that cycle of like, oh, but now I spent all day by myself. I don't really want to have the energy to go and see my friends in the evening because
it feeds on itself. I mean, I think it feeds. I mean, there's a whole discussion in my country about youth who just don't want to get started with life. They just want to recline. I mean, the boys, the young men, they're happy with playing games online. I think it's especially serious for young men as opposed to young women. But there's this whole thing about simply taking care of yourself, being alone, and not wanting like any commitments to anything. And I think it just shows that being socialized to have deep relationships and to have a sense of obligation to each other, and being, I would use the term, forgive the term, embedded and embodied. We're embodied, that means we're in person with other people, and we're embedded in institutions and some community. That's something that it seems it wasn't true before. At least it wasn't true. We didn't think it would be true, but it seems that it's true that these things have to be socialized. We have to practice this. It's in our best interest, but it's not automatic. And that people are easy to withdraw into themselves if we're not really spending time with people. And so I think on a society level, countries have like these ministers and these offices in government for loneliness and talk about depression, but they don't have any idea what the problem is.
Yeah.
It's not a government policy per se that can fix it. It's not about what does the government do? We'll have an office. We'll go around educating everybody. We'll hire some fancy consultants. We'll come up with some policy document. We'll have some conferences. we'll spend some money, but actually, if you don't address the
There's no
structural
people.
reason, the conference will be virtual, of course. So the whole thing is, if you don't address, this is a structural problem in terms of how we're designing our society. And it's not something you're going to do not going to change like with conferences and things like that. Yes, we could have a conference and get to the solution, but I'm skeptical of government offices and I'm skeptical of educating people to change, because if they don't have a reason to change, they're not going to change.
So I guess I have two questions. One, because it sounds like, well, one, I guess you were traveling all around the world and you were working in fragile states, but your most recent work has brought you back to look at the fragile neighborhoods in the US. So what was it that made you turn your outward work inward, in a sense? Yeah. At what moment did you realize that you wanted to turn all your knowledge and experience towards the United States?
I would say it was, people asked me actually, 2015, 2016, if you know US politics, let's just say the wrong person was winning the election, and people in Washington all knew me as the fragile states person. So I would go to have a coffee with somebody, or I would be meeting somebody, and they would ask me, half serious, I think half jokingly, is the United States becoming a fragile state? And they look at the choice of voters in an election and their anxiety about the future of democracy and populism, whatever you want to describe what was happening. And they say, is that going to make us fragile? Are we becoming fragile? My immediate reaction is, politics is downstream from society. And if something has happened in politics that, let's just say, we don't think is healthy for the country, that is not necessarily, and I would still say I'm very positive about our democracy, and I think that we have a strong system, and whatever happens, I have confidence in the system. Mm-hmm. But that anxiety about what the political choices suggests that something deeper is happening, something's going on, that there's some social decay or social problems that is driving the politics. It's not only the choice, but also the polarization, the anger, the alienation, the conspiracy theories, whatever the extreme positions people take. And I'm saying that I recognize people's worry, but I don't agree with the focus. The focus, you could do some things to change the electoral system. And again, all this stuff about we're going to change voters' opinions and educate and all that. For me, let's go upstream and see what has changed with our relationships. And we have the same system of government. And in 2 generations, we went from, let's say, a healthy political dynamic to an unhealthy political dynamic. And the system hasn't changed dramatically. Something underlying it must have changed. So I set off on my typical journey. I wandered around the country. Again, I know surprisingly little about the United States. And I grew up here. I know the big cities, but I've not been to the heartland. I've not been to most of the South, whatever. I basically flew over the country and went to some cities on the coast, like whatever people, well-educated people, not the people elsewhere aren't, but people from New York or Washington or San Francisco, LA. That's how they think about the country often. And they don't really know the country. So I think I was probably very representative of that. So I went to Kentucky. I went to Detroit. I went to Louisiana, and so on and so forth. And I asked people questions. I organized some seminars about social capital relationships. I read and I read and I read. And I came to the conclusion, based upon everything I had seen around the world, was in fragile states, the problem is not locally. Locally, communities are strong. The problem tends to be nationally, in terms of bringing the groups together, in terms of having some sort of national capacity, national cohesion, national integration, and things like that. I thought in the United States, we have great national institutions. We do have some political divisions, but what really has changed is the nature of local relationships. And if we went from a country, a society, I think it's true to a great extent in many, many developed countries, went to societies where We had an abundance of institutions, an abundance of relationships, abundance of local support systems. And then we went in 2 generations to very little of that. How will people change? That's my question. So people will look nationally, not locally, for answers. They will become more mistrustful of each other. They will become more alienated. They will feel, I hate to use the word anomic, or like anomic. That's a sociological term. They'll feel a little bit lost at sea from what's going on around them. They will basically. So I think the politics is a product of the disconnection locally, and also a great feeling that many Americans feel they cannot do anything to make their lives better. Mm-hmm. If you're invested in a local community with local institutions, many people can step up and be a leader and actually do something. If that is gone and all you have is distant politics, and if you're not one of these elite circles, society is doing to you, the economy is doing to you, and you're basically powerless. All you can do is sort of survive. You can't thrive. To thrive, you need to have some ownership, stake on what is going on, some sense of agency. And without a strong local, with lots of opportunities locally to make your place better, people have no sense of agency, ownership. And it just, the whole politics is coming from the disconnection.
That's interesting. So from your work in fragile states, did that also teach you about the importance of kind of community and local community and connection, and show you the difference between the US and some of the countries that you traveled to?
Yes, for sure. I would say that a healthy society must be healthy on the local. There's probably a middle, what we might call the meso. I hate to use these micro, meso, macro, local, middle, and there's society operates on many levels, and a healthy society will work well on each of these levels. If you go to I used to live in Nigeria, and whenever I spent time in, I've been in, again, most of the Middle East I've been in, and all sorts of other countries, about 75 countries. What you see in many, many places is locally, there's a sense of community, there's a sense of belonging. It might be that because there's an extended family, clan, ethnic group, might be religion. There's many sources of that glue. Some of it might be just geographical, and people, so people may not be wealthy, but there's a thick web of support and a sense of belonging. And so these places, they're not getting as wealthy as the rich countries are. They tend to be more politically unstable, but they don't have all these problems we have with depression, mental illness, loneliness, isolation, disconnection. I mean, even though sometimes their politics are really messed up, there's not this sense of alienation. There might be a lack of belief in the government, but they don't feel so alienated from everything around them that we have in our societies. There's a whole sense of social problems. You can even look at the problem of drugs. The United States, Scotland in particular, probably the England less so, real problems with drug overdoses. I think that's partly, there's a supply element, but there's also a demand element that people are depressed. They don't feel they have any meaning in their life. They don't have a sense of connection. There's no support system. And that's like an outlet. It's like people take medicine for an outlet to try to deal with their issues. They may also take drugs as an outlet. And I think if we had stronger communities, we would have less of that. So I think you could look at loads of social problems, and many of them can be connected to what we have as this great disconnection that's upstream.
And when you traveled around the US, I know that your book is really focused on it's more like a guide. It's teaching people and inspiring people on how to kind of get out of this crisis of disconnection. Why was that so important to you, to ensure that you included practical steps and examples where this was actually working?
There's two. First, I mean, I have a day job in which I try to help fragile societies, fragile states. I personally work on Libya, Nigeria. I was in Ukraine in December. I work on, I mean, as you know, I was just in Mexico. So I work on a variety of countries, and no one is paying me to be abstract. I mean, my work is to try to come up with practical ways forward. And my general theory of change in all these countries is I'm not looking up here for the magic bullet, the policy that will change things. I'm looking for ways, and all of my work is how to give society or catalyze society to have the capacity to solve its own problems. This is my worldview. My worldview is, what can we do? There are sometimes government involvement, but my real starting point is, how do we galvanize society, give it the tools, give it the frameworks, have convenings, have meetings. And so, but answer to your question, everything is practical. And then when I come and look at the US, one is, that's my mindset. But on the second level is, if you look at the books, and believe me, I read at least 50 books on this topic. The most famous, of course, are Robert Putnam's books on bowling alone and disconnection. There's lots of books lamenting what we lost. There's lots of books diagnosing the problem. It's almost impossible to find any practical ideas about what do we do about it. The closest you get is we need to have family dinners. So there's not, so I'm all for family dinners, but there's not like any framework to think about how do we go, where do we go from here? So for me, as a person who likes to think in frameworks, and I want to be practical, people don't want another book telling them what's wrong.
Yeah.
They want suggestions. So my book has roughly 50 practical suggestions. I mean, that includes, everything from what organizations can do. There are some policy, but not tons of it. How we are as individuals should rethink our priorities. All of that is, I'm speaking to multiple audiences, but I want to be practical. I want people to say, I can do this to help my neighborhood. If I'm running an organization, if I'm running a philanthropy, if I'm an urban leader or a social leader, what can I do to make a difference? That's the mindset we should take.
And I think there's something so empowering about that, because it is so easy to, in the UK too, to complain about our political system, to complain about everything that's going on, and sometimes feel like you're almost helpless to do anything about it. But working on a local level, giving everybody the agency to be able to make improvements to their lives, where they live, their community, that's so empowering, because you're taking positive steps towards like improving things.
Yes, I'm not a fan of complaining.
Yeah.
I think it's no different in the United States. We love to say what's wrong with our politicians, our policies, our government. But if the focus is on the local, not the national, and you can be hyper local, you can be just in your neighborhood. If you think at that scale, a very human scale, each of us can actually do something. We can do something in our immediate block with our neighbors. We can try to find a few friends, or, they don't have to be friends. In my neighborhood, I have a few friends, but I know hundreds of people. So it's not like everyone is a friend, but it means you have relationships. What can I do with relationships? Do something, try to find a few partners, find a local association. I'm on the board of one organization. I contribute a lot to another organization in various volunteer and other ways. So you can find things that you can, or organizations or activities you can engage with, and you can become a leader. You can stand up and play a really positive role, real place, real people, real relationships. It's not distant. It's not virtual. It's not frustration. It's incremental progress. You can see that you're making a difference.
I think the example that you gave in Detroit was a really great example of community growth and a community project that was really uplifting the community. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit about that, and also about what led Detroit to get to that place, first of all, of being a fragile neighborhood, from having been such a thriving city when it was kind of, if you could go into that, that would be really interesting.
I'll be happy to. Thank you. Let's be practical. Let's get to very specific examples. That's good. So, Fenella, if you went to Detroit, I don't think you've been in Detroit before. And I knew something about Detroit. I had not been in Detroit. So what did I do? The first day I arrived, I had to get in my rent-a-car, and I drove zigzagged, and because I just knew what I would see would be like unthinkable. Detroit is about 1/3 the population that it was, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago. 1/3. It was 2 million. Now it's about 650,000. And what happens, and this is a city in which a large part of the city was houses, and then lots of local institutions, schools, churches, nonprofits, businesses. And you drive and you feel like you're in like some sort of post-war or post like incredible upheaval. You literally go to neighborhoods in which the neighborhood is gone. There's some decaying houses. There's some trees. I mean, a lot of the wreckage has been removed. I think they've removed hundreds of thousands of houses, but you can still see people living in houses there are like a few houses left in what was a neighborhood. And those houses are, in many cases, these are poor people. They have no place to go or falling apart. You can find, it's amazing. You can find beautiful buildings, beautiful Gothic schools that were abandoned because the city ran out of money and have collapsed. You can find churches like that. You can find former automobile factories in which you literally probably could walk, I don't know, like a mile across this whole landscape, and all you see is abandoned buildings, broken glass, garbage, sort of beginning of growth sprouting through. It's almost like if you went to a place that was destroyed by a war and you came back 50 years later, what would I see? You would probably see something like what I see. And so this is Detroit. And
was that because it was like a thriving hub for the automobile industry and all those?
I mean, it was a thriving hub. The modern automobile, the Model T Ford, the first mass-produced car. I actually went to the museum. I had to go to the museum to see where they made the first mass-produced car, somewhere around, I don't know, 1910. Don't quote me on the date, around then. And then eventually they moved to a much bigger site. But I had to see, and of course, it was so beautiful to see, like it was like a museum of the first 20 years of the automobile. So they have all these incredible cars. I wish I could drive one around. Didn't get that chance. There, it's a museum. It's there. And so anyway, so this city is basically on its knees. It went bankrupt 10 years ago. It has begun to stabilize. And what's interesting is in this disaster, so to speak, and there's many reasons why this happened. One was race. People, basically there was riots, and then there was a lot of white flight, and there was a lot of anger, and there was racial, where people could live was based upon your race. And when some of that began to break down, a lot of people left. There was also problems with the factories moving. So there was economic, there was social, there was a lot of things going on. So that's a whole different conversation. But basically you get to this place and there's a lot of social entrepreneurs, a lot of social innovation, because it's like a great place for experimentation, because there's great need, there's great opportunity, and the city doesn't have a lot of money. So, and there's a lot of philanthropy in the suburbs trying to help the city. So there's a lot of things going on. So there's one guy who started an organization called Life Remodeled. Originally was a pastor, wanted to preach outside the church, not inside the church. So he started basically trying to help the family, and then trying to eventually help the streets. And gradually he stopped being a pastor and he ran this nonprofit. And he eventually got to a scale where he was helping many neighborhoods. And what they were doing was they were organizing thousands and thousands of volunteers for a 6-day event every year to clean up, to plant things, to beautify neighborhoods, and for homes, and whatever, they obviously they couldn't do all the homes, but homes, they would replace like the heating unit, they would fix the roof. They were basically doing things for homes and doing things for neighborhoods. And he was doing this for several years, and he had developed a reputation, and he was working in lots of neighborhoods. And he was thinking, how do I get to the next level? How do I make a bigger impact on specific neighborhoods? And the city came to him at some point. There was some conversation and says, we have to abandon one of our beautiful buildings because the student population was shrinking. And we're going to consolidate basically what used to be 3 buildings, primary, middle, and high school. We're going to be consolidated in the high school. I think one of the schools was already gone, but there was this middle school that's this incredibly beautiful building. I mean, huge, 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 beautiful, built in the 1920s. They couldn't afford it. They didn't want it to be trashed, so to speak. And again, this is the time period where you built schools as neighborhood schools. So the school is the whole compound is in the middle of the neighborhood. We don't realize how much of the physical landscape was built for the sake of neighborhoods and neighborhood relationships. But this was a great example. And so he said, and they talked, this can become a neighborhood hub. And we can draw on lots of organizations, and this will help the neighborhood. This will provide opportunities for business, nonprofits, whatever it might be, parts of government, and it will basically be a way to uplift everybody in the neighborhood. Sounds like a great idea. He was confident that he had the trust of people because he had been working with them and talking to them, except the city gave him this property for $1 a year for 50 years, because there's a lot of operational costs, renovation costs, and who else is going to take it and maintain the building and everything. But when he announced this, and here's this white guy from the suburbs or from out of state, I think he's from Indiana, and the city is very black and the neighborhood is very black, he had a big backlash. People were calling him names. People were very unhappy that this outsider was coming in. And I mean, even his black employees were called names, I think they were called like Oreo, which is like, I think black outside, white inside, some sort of thing about that. So it wasn't pretty.
Because they didn't trust him.
They didn't trust him. So it's a whole thing about trust. The most foundational thing for a good relationship is a level of trust. And of course, there's different levels of trust. So he first didn't understand that the kind of trust he got for giving to people was very different than the kind of trust you need to live among people and also take charge of a very important asset of theirs. They looked at the school and the building as an asset, and they're asking, why did one of us not get this chance? Why did they give it to you? So it's one thing, I'll take your money, I'll take your roof, I'll take you beautifying my streets, but here you are taking something that's ours, and you're going to set up shop and live next to us. That is a completely different paradigm of trust. And he had to learn it. He had to basically sit there and listen and be told. He had someone who worked for him, a guy named Dwan, black guy who knew the thinking of the people, and says, you just listen, you just absorb, but then you go back and you think hard about what it is you need to do differently. And so instead of trying to explain his way out of it, in which our rational minds think we ought to do, because there's a rational reason why they should accept him, you have to first step back and build a relationship with them. And part of that relationship is you got to hear them out. Yeah. You got to listen. You have to be abused. And so that's part of, if you can take the abuse and show them you still want a relationship, that's positive. And then he had to go around and he had to learn, again, big meetings, lots of people. It might not always be the right avenue to build trust, because again, you have the worst people stand up and speak, and then it creates like a cascading effect. So he did something different. He went street by street and he broke bread with people.
Mhm.
He went street to street and talked to people. He just went around and got to know people, and it would be him and maybe some of his colleagues. And so there was one thing he did. Another thing he did, he did lots of small group meetings while he was going around talking, eating with people. Very different feeling when there's a few people and you're just in their properties or on the street. And so that's about relationship building. That's not about making announcements. And that's not people trying to show off for each other through their speech about how they feel. That's about actually just getting to know people and being much more intimate. Another thing he learned was you got to hire people who are from this place. You have to be, if you want to be a part of this place, that should mean that your staff. So instead, I mean, he had perfectly capable people. It wasn't about their skills. It's about who the people in the neighborhood would recognize as one of them. And so hire people in the neighborhood or from nearby the neighborhood, people who spoke their language, looked like them, reflected what they wanted. So that was something else. He literally changed the composition of who his organization was. Another thing he did was he looked for local leaders. In many of these neighborhoods, there's a lot of people with small kids that come and go, high transiency, but there tends to be some older people who stick around and have been there for a long time. So he looked for the elder statesmen. He also looked for something with students because he was in a school. So he created 2 advisory boards. And then, of course, he spent a lot of time asking people what they wanted. And he formulated his plan based on what they wanted, what the advisory board said, what the new staff were saying. And this process was like a whole formula for how do you build trust. And the end result was, after a period of time, he gained their trust. He gained their buy-in. He brought in the organizations. COVID complicated things a bit, but he has 39 organizations. He's in some ways, he's helped everybody in the neighborhood in many ways, as well as surrounding neighborhoods. And this is when you bring in institutions to a distressed neighborhood, institutions are the real key, because institutions can change the social dynamics. They can incubate other institutions. They bring resources in. There's a lot of things that institutions can do that just one-off ad hoc helping cannot do. We have to think about institutions, and institutions that are firmly planted, not up here doing services, firmly planted and owned and part of a neighborhood, and they will help grow a forest of other institutions and norms of helping each other. That's what we have to think in terms of change. Sorry for going a bit long there, but there's a lot there.
No, it's so interesting. And I think another point you mentioned in your book is that it's not a quick fix. These are long-term strategies that require
even if you're in a materially well-off neighborhood that's socially poor, because we're not just talking about poor places. We're talking about not everywhere, but let's say 3/4 or whatnot of our neighborhoods are socially disconnected. So even if you're a materially well-off place, you don't have sometimes all this problems with housing and problems with institutions, but still problems with housing. Some of the economic material problems you may not have, but you may not have any local institutions. You may not have any place where people can gather. So these are things that generally take several years at a minimum, sometimes longer, to incrementally change the culture, the opportunities to bring people together. All of this takes time. We need to be patient, and we need to think incremental. One by one, we make change.
And so how long has this project been going on for in Detroit?
So Detroit Life Remodeled, Chris Lambert, I believe probably started around 2011, 2012. The center I talked about is roughly started around 2019. But I think the full implementation, we passed through COVID, we're several years into the full implementation, but the initial part that I discussed in terms of that anger and that trust building is the year before COVID, 2019.
And what are the positive impacts that it's having on the society in that area of Detroit?
Well, again, if we consider disconnection to be something that we need to tackle. Disconnection takes many forms, but by bringing these institutions in, and not just bringing any institutions in, bringing institutions that people want, but also asking for each of these 39 organizations he brought in, that you're not here to work alone. You're here to build sort of like connections between you, connections with people in the neighborhood. It's very intentional, this idea about building connections and building like bridging across efforts. So they have like monthly convenings where representatives of organizations come, residents come. They themselves go out and knock on doors to talk about what they're doing, especially in the warm weather, maybe not so much in the cold weather because Detroit's pretty cold in the winter. They're doing lots of things to connect it. So I think what you end up seeing is there's a lot more opportunities for youth, like mentorship programs, internships, maybe even actual jobs, connections to jobs. So by bringing institutions to people, first of all, people get more connected to whatever it's the healthcare or the after school or some club or jobs, whatever it is. Connection is important for all of that. But also by being very intentional about having these organizations cooperate and work with people in the neighborhood, they're trying hard to incubate spinoffs. It's really important when you work in a place, you want to create spinoffs. You don't want to think that I'm here to do my one thing in a siloed manner. You want to think that our goal is the neighborhood. Our goal is not my one service. And that I want to operate in a way that creates spinoffs. I mean, I've seen organizations that actually don't mind or actively encourage some of their staff to leave to work in other institutions. I don't think this happens in this life remodeled example, my example in Kentucky, where they are happy, where they train up people and the people go work for a partner, the people go work for the local government, the people leave and start something for their own, because spinoffs is a sign of success. I think too often people just focus on their single goal, but when you're building institutions, you want to flood an area with lots of institutions and you want to strengthen what's there. So anytime you see that, that's very good. So I think in answer to your question, you see much better social capital, you see better education outcomes, you see kids more connected to jobs, and so on and so forth.
You also discussed the importance of a sideways approach in repairing social ties in neighborhoods. What is the difference between this and the top-down approach that so many organizations use?
I think we generally, Fenella, we generally speak of top-down. Sometimes we speak of bottom-up. Yeah. So I want to say sideways is different than both. Top-down is very much could be government. We think of it, it means government, the central government distributing something, and I have no say, and it's one formula for the whole country. So that's top down. But I would say even philanthropy and nonprofits often work very top down. They may often say we want to consult with the community, but it could be checking the box, or it could be somewhat superficial. They're working when you work from a distance, you're very top down. And when you work from sort of a set formula, you're very top down. Bottom up, I generally would praise more than top down. But the problem with bottom up, it tends to be very local. It could be very easily not connected to anything larger than the very specific local. Sideways has a few meanings. One meaning is sideways is we focus on relationships. Relationships are between us, with us. They're not just a secondary element to what we want to do. We want to strengthen relationships at scale in a place, in a neighborhood. That is sideways. Sideways means thinking about the neighborhood as a whole, not thinking about my one-off things or what have you in a very shallow manner. But I think sideways on a broader level is about thinking about society sideways. How do we measure the well-being of society? We're very typically using vertical indicators, GDP and GDP growth. I think growth is great. I think we need growth. I'm not against growth, but it is a very poor indicator of how we feel and how we're experiencing it. It also can mean that some are benefiting, others are not. It could mean also that materially we're gaining and socially we're losing. So the point is,
growth at what expense?
at what expense? So we need constructive growth. We need growth that improves people's well-being. And of course, I will always say there's things that we don't measure that are hugely important. I mean, we're not producing growth here, Fenella. It's not going to be in the GDP indicator, but well, maybe individually every member will be growing who listens, but I mean, relationships are not measured, and that's one reason why we don't emphasize relationships as how we think of society, because it's not measured, it's not producing something. What would happen if we had a Dreamer Gentry, who I write about, and she says that would it be great if we had some measure of society well-being as a calculation that put every neighborhood or every place, they measured it, and we would combine them all in a huge measurement. And that's brilliant. How do you do that? Of course, is challenging. But if we could have GDP, I don't know, GSP, gross social product, and somehow be in every different neighborhood, that's what we really want. And so horizontal is thinking about how we're doing on a, it's like I wander, you spend all your time traveling around Brazil. Is it that just Rio is doing well, or Sao Paulo is doing well, or what have you? But what is happening in Belém? What is happening in Manaus? What is happening in the Northeast? I mean, the country could be improving as a whole, but parts of the country could be sinking. And and you're not measuring it horizontally.
Or you have, like, Brazil has like the ninth, I think it's the ninth economy in the world, but then you have, I can't remember the percentage of people living in poverty, but it's extremely high. Is it 30%?
I couldn't tell you offhand, but I could say it's a country that has done a lot of, I mean, it's done some great things. It's a big country. It has some dynamic companies, great infrastructure in places, not everywhere, of course, but it has, it's not working for lots of places, and it's not working for lots of people, and that's not very horizontal.
Do you
and I would just say, excuse me, if you're thinking about globalization and changes in technology, I would say that is one of the great challenges of our age, is that so much is going on that's not benefiting across our societies. And that's where the anger and alienation in our politics is coming from. Please, sorry.
No, I was going to say, do you think we need to make it a measurable thing, like social relationship score? I know in some countries they now have like a happiness index, because if all we're doing is measuring individual wealth and wealth of the country, do we need to have a measurement of social relationships in order for governments to prioritize them?
I think we do. Of course, the challenge always is, how do you compute it? And even happiness, again, I'm skeptical when we just look at the individual. I do think I mean, the individual freedom, individual rights, hugely important. How much have we have so much more to go, but we have gone so far in the centuries to advance this idea. So I'm totally for this idea, but at the same time, we need to think more of as people, as persons, and less as autonomous individuals. Persons is a more complete understanding, and persons thrive when they're embedded in strong social context, strong sets of relationships. So the question is, if that's essential to our health, our happiness, our well-being, our ability to contribute to our economies even, how do we measure that? But that's a really hard thing to measure. I wish I had an easy way to do that. You and I can come up with a project. We'll get funding. We'll call ourselves consultants, and we'll get a great. We'll come up with some. It's not easy to do. I've had this. Yes, let's do it.
Do you think that societies that are more individualistic would score less highly in our imagined study? then society
Well,
more
I hope it's not imagined. So I think
niche.
this is a challenging question because I think let's give an example here. Let's put some data on this.
Okay.
If you look at the data on youth and depression and like suicide since 2012, the smartphone has taken over,
Okay.
especially among young people. And there's a lot of data. I didn't produce this data. Jonathan Haidt and other people, I don't know if you know that name. He's a very well-known name here at New York University, and he's got a book coming out. Not that I want to advertise someone else's book, but I would just say I've been reading his stuff, so I'm very familiar with this because I'm very worried about disconnection. And he's doing some sort of global comparison, and what he's showing is disconnection. Remember, it's not normal for people to grow up and to not be in healthy relationships. And what he is showing is that when the smartphone takes over from the personal relationships, basically starting in 2012, you are seeing a great decline in happiness, a great increase in depression, a great increase in like even self-hurting and trips to the hospital and all this type of stuff. I'm sure there's many people doing great. I mean, I'm on my phone all day. I have to say, I have my own addiction to my phone, but I didn't grow up with a smartphone. In fact, I used to travel and you would have no phone. You would have to figure it out. You sometimes I didn't have a map. You have to follow your nose, basically. Where's my nose going to take me? Somewhere there I have to go. And so that was a different world. But I would say the key point here is he shows that the more individualistic societies, the kids are being hurt more by the phone. And places with more religion and more communitarian cultures, the phones are having much less of an impact because people are much more likely to be embedded in institutions and relationships culturally. So there's more of a shock absorber than there is in the very individualistic societies, the people who are less likely to belong to other people or a community, less likely to belong to. He also looks at faith. He also looks at, I mean, he even looks at your political persuasion and who's more likely to be affected simply because they're less likely to have strong relationships. And he's got a whole bunch of data. So in answer to your question, I think what you will find is that, I mean, the individualistic societies, I think they have more dynamic economies. They're more flexible in terms of adapting to challenges. And they tend often to be better at absorbing immigrants. And so there's a lot of benefits of individualistic societies. I think the downside is they're more vulnerable to disconnection. They're more vulnerable to loneliness. The number of friends that people in the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries have, they're steadily declining. It's much less true in Southern Europe. And we on English-speaking countries are much more vulnerable, I think, to the problems of the phone and what the phone is doing to our lives.
I wonder, I mean, yeah, I even read a study about loneliness in Australia, and it was saying that 1 in 3.
Yes, I used that statistic 2 nights ago when I gave a talk to Australia. So there you go. Good timing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sorry. Good timing. I had a whole page of Australian statistics.
Some people would say that in warmer countries, it's easier to have social connections because you're outside more.
The climate. This is the question is it the climate or is it the culture? I wonder about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard this argument. I've even heard an argument when I was a child, when I was small, that because colder climates force people to work harder. That's why people in colder climates were richer. Now, I don't think we would say that today. So I'm just wondering. I mean, if you look at a map, it is true that but again, Singapore is pretty wealthy, and Singapore is really hot. And Chile. I don't know. I mean, there's places that are rich today that are warm. So I'm not sure I agree with that, actually.
And also, surely Australia has a warm climate.
I think it's warm. I do think they have winters. I think what you would find, I think we could find some places that have pretty much their social fabric has also broken down significantly, and they live in a very warm climate. So I'm not quite convinced that is correct.
It's a false generalization that the colder the climate, the colder the people.
I mean, there seems to be some correlation, so I can't say you're wrong, but I think we could find some. I bet we could find some. We could find some exceptions to that for sure.
In these studies that you were talking about, was the focus on youth disconnection?
Yes, in particular, because I think if you study changes in generation, again, this is not my field, but I'm very interested in the social dynamics, so I read all this type of stuff. So you can see, and there's an author, Jane Twing, if I pronounce it correct, who does this type of research, and her broad theory about generational change is that the way people in each generation interact with technology, because she's looking at basically the last 100 years of generational change, and every generation has dealt with different technology. Again, how do you define generation? She has her formula. And that the biggest change in terms of the culture or the worldview or the way people interact with each other in every generation is being changed by technology. So everyone is becoming more and more individualistic. And therefore, the way to understand a generation, of course, we don't know how people will change. The 15-year-olds, what will they be like when they're 50? They'll probably be, again, complaining about the 15-year-olds. This is like the norm of human history. But I think from her studies, she's, so when it comes to what you're talking about, I think the real impact is on the generation that did not experience youth without the smartphone. And so you see some of this negative statistics bleeding into the generation above. But when you get to the generations past that, you don't see the same impact. So there's the first generation to grow up in the phone, like the phone culture. The one before that has some of that impact, and then it's not really an impact. So what will that mean in 20, 30, 40 years? I mean, you, at least where I sit, being a little bit older than a youth, is that there's a lot of negativity about the future and a lot of like not positive vibes among young people. I think part of that is how they experience life and relationships through the phone. I bet some of it is worry about climate change and all of that stuff. I can look at the problems of the world. We were talking a little bit about this before, and I can say, I feel positive. I can do something about it. I will think optimistically about my future and the world's future because I've seen how far we've come. But I think if you're very young and you grow up with the phone and all you see is the girls with Instagram, oh, I'm not pretty enough, I don't have the right clothes on, whatever it is, or the boys with the competition on video games and they have nothing else, what kind of life is that? And maybe you end up with certain tendencies and beliefs and outlooks which I don't think are representative of the world.
And I guess also if you're on your phone in an isolated way, not in community, not with other people, then that actually also heightens your fear response and your perception of the world as a threat.
Yes, exactly. I mean, think we build trust in the world. I even think that our worldview is so affected by our own personal experience. People have shown studies that if you grow up, you're a certain generation and the economy was doing bad, you have a very different worldview than if you grew up and the economy is doing very well. So you go ahead.
So the kids that I was teaching in Rio and Lucia don't think of Brazil as really good at football as a country, because none of them have seen Brazil win a World Cup. But my generation, we always think, if you're thinking of the countries who are the best at football, Brazil. But I was told at the school none of them have seen Brazil win a World Cup. They might have seen when they lost. So it's interesting, like how even though Brazil haven't won for a while, I still
Yes.
think of them as the country that's.
I mean, I think they've won 5 World Cups, if my memory is correct. They've won more than any other country.
None in the last 10 years.
Well, I mean, if you're 15 years old, that's your memory. So I think, but also I think our relationships, if we're not experiencing relationships that make me feel trustful of others, how will I be trustful of anything? Just think of what that means. So if you're young and your experience with other people is competition, zero-sum competition, fighting for attention, not making people feel good about themselves, if that's all you know, why will you trust anything? Just think about that. And that's why not only, I had some experience being bullied as a youth. It doesn't mean that your in-person experience is always positive, but I also had lots of relationships. I played on the street. I went to friends' homes, sports, everything. And so I had, let's say, a mixed bag, but you had enough of real stuff going on that, of course, I come up and I feel trustworthy, positive. But if you have everything virtual or mostly virtual, and it's mostly not a strong experience, I just think it changes everything.
So, in terms of that, what advice would you give to listeners to address social disconnection within their own neighborhood and, I guess, their own family environment, young people, to foster this stronger sense of community and connection?
I would say a few things. Again, if we're talking about individuals, I would certainly say if you're in a place, let's say you're in a neighborhood, I would look out the most simple thing is look out your door, see who lives near you, and see if there's at least 1 or 2 of those houses that you might have someone you can have at least some relationship with. That's the most basic. If you look in your immediate area, can you have a couple of people that you know well enough that you can meet? Maybe you can organize something together. Again, we all need friendships, but what I think is even more important that's underappreciated, we need relationships. We need some sense of community. So are there associations you can join, volunteer with, play a leadership role, organizations, institutions are important because they're here today and they're going to be there tomorrow and they're going to be there the day after. And if you can get involved and play a role, it becomes regular. What we want is recurring interaction with people. So, if you know a few people, can you organize a block party? Can you organize some sort of, you could be minimal and ambitious. You could be very ambitious, but the minimal level is have some activities in your neighborhood. Don't do this alone. Find 2, 3, 4 partners. More ambitious could be, I know this guy, Mac McCarter in Shreveport, and he basically eventually built this whole network that he says there's 50,000 people in the city, about 1 out of every 6 people who now are what he calls his We Care team. And they have a We Care sign on their street, and they're trying to create norms of caring street by street. He has block connectors he's got some sort of neighborhood connectors. He even eventually raised money to build friendship houses in the poor neighborhoods, so there'd be a more day in and day out. He sends 2 people to live there and to help people in the neighborhood, again, with the relationships as the foundation, bonding and then eventually bridging. So the thing is, you could just be doing stuff for yourself. You could be doing stuff with others and an association. But I think in every case, it's best if you have a few people you know that you're doing this with. It feels less hard. It feels more possible. And I would just say, take baby steps and then try to make each of those steps a little farther from the last one. And don't expect great change immediately. But ideally, you're trying to make it normal that you talk with people. Make it normal that you help each other. Make it normal that you knock on the door or It makes you feel better. I feel joy when I walk down the street because I know people in the neighborhood. I know who to say hi to. I know who's behind the doors. I know what their houses are like. But if you can change that culture locally, that would be your ultimate goal.
I felt that in Rio. I knew, like, in a way that I haven't felt in Brixton. I have a boxing gym that I feel that sense of community.
Oh no, I better be careful.
But in Rio, like, I would just walk down the street and I knew everyone there and I would bump into people. But yeah, I think you have to make more of a conscious effort in London. You definitely have to make a conscious effort to get to know your neighbors. Otherwise, you could live somewhere 3 years and
I mean, it's hard, and I think if you live in a small town, it might be more normal for this to happen. Cities, I think London to a certain extent as well. It's more obvious in France or the Netherlands or Italy that the cities literally originally were built around neighborhoods. There's like a neighborhood school, there's a neighborhood church, there's a neighborhood park, there might be a neighborhood civic, some government institution. I don't think London is quite like that, even though the neighborhoods are very identifiable, to the extent that the neighborhoods had more of a sense of identity and sense of things that were specific to the place. It would make it much easier. Otherwise, and I think people are very transactional, but I do believe there's lots of organizations in London. It's incredible, the abundance of organizations. The question is, are some of them local enough that you can get to know people that you would not know otherwise? Yeah. Especially people who are different. I mean, what's so special about a good neighborhood is people have different views. Yeah. I mean, people have different political views. I mean, I'm in a neighborhood where I don't know someone's political views unless we get into the conversation. We mostly don't talk politics. I don't want to talk politics. I have no sign on my front yard. I have no sign on my cars. I don't want anything like politics get in the way of my life. But I don't know, and I actually don't even know their class. We have a few neighbors that are very wealthy. I mean, their houses are a bit bigger. And I have some neighbors, I think they're probably struggling to pay the bills. We even have some nonprofits where people can get goods. You can donate things you don't need, kids' clothes and everything, and people will need it. So we have multiple classes. We have multiple races. We have many languages spoken in my neighborhood. And a good neighbor will have a good amount of diversity, and you're going to meet people you would not meet normally. I mean, too much of our lives today are with people who are too much like us, and we want to have people who are not so much like us. So a good neighbor should have that as well.
And so what makes your neighborhood so special?
I mean, there's several elements. I mean, one element is physically more of a neighborhood. I mean, we have a center. I don't think the center is very beautiful, to be very honest, but it is a center. I mean, it's like a little bit like a small mall with like ugly parking and not very pretty shops, but there's restaurants, there's a supermarket. I walk there. I don't need a car. I always will know people in these places. I mean, I go to the restaurant, I have to say hi. I know the owner of the restaurant that I go to the most. The supermarket, I sometimes I'm a bit of a cave dweller. I wish I could go in and escape, but I go in and there's always like 3 people. So I'm not a good model, but there's always 3 or 4 people I can at least say hi to. How are you doing? Sometimes talk to one of them. So we have that. We have the physical. We have institutions. We have lots of small businesses. We have a bunch of nonprofits. We have houses of worship. So I would say religion helps in my neighborhood because we have a lot of people who are religious. When religious people tend to congregate more with each other than elsewhere. Small businesses. We have the physical layout of the place. So I think all those things. We have civic associations. We also have parks. We have local schools. I mean, literally most of the neighbors' kids, they go to the same schools. We have and there's a park half a block here. There's another green area, like a block there. So we have, I would say it's not built to be a neighborhood, but by fortuitous chance, we have a lot of elements that make it a strong neighborhood.
No,
Are you jealous? You're ready to come any moment.
It sounds nice. I will come, and then we can go for a beer and get coffee.
And there's not walking distance, but there's an Irish pub about a mile and a half from here. Yes, I bet. I had used to be my neighbor, a guy who writes on the similar topics. He has moved, but I used to meet him for drinks there. So, or I'll find a better place for you. Don't worry.
To be fair, I think where I live has a lot of the potential, and I'm sure there are community groups, like it is a thriving community. I just feel like maybe I haven't as well.
You need to use your Brazilian eyes. You have Brazilian eyes now, and you have a sense of community. So what do you have to do? There's probably, it's a big city, so there's probably a lot of stuff that's not local, but there's probably some things that are local, and there's probably some people involved with that. And again, it's a question of choices. We have too many choices today. When it used to be, our main choice was local. That's what everybody did. So we have to encourage it more, in my opinion.
Definitely. I think like that there's a market, Brixton Market, like buying fruit at the market means that you have
I've been there before. It's pretty dynamic.
Oh, that's like, yeah, that's really close to where I live. So yeah, yes. I'm going to take my Brazilian eyes and use them to curate a more
your Portuguese must be amazing. I have to say, if you were in the favela for several months, your Portuguese must be amazing.
It's gotten a little better.
Yeah, and the Portuguese music is so good. I don't know what it is compared to. I happen to like Portuguese over Spanish music, so I hope you came home with some good tunes.
Yeah, I did. I'm going to be playing them in my. Okay. Well, thank you so much for our conversation. It's been amazing. We usually end on 2 questions.
Go for it. Don't let me fail your protocol.
But you failed.
This is like a ritual.
So the first question is, when did you last feel disconnected?
I saw your questions. In all fairness, Fenella did send me these questions, and I looked at that and I said, this is not an easy question because I think I feel disconnected when I think the first as a minimum to be disconnected, you have to be not so busy.
Yeah.
And the last months have been very busy. I've been running around doing a lot of talking and combine that with travel. So I would say a few things will lead me to be disconnected. So I think probably, let's say a year or so ago was the last time I felt it. It's probably it's a period of time when I'm not so busy, when I feel a little bit unsure of where I'm going in life, and I feel a need to talk to people. I mean, I'm very easy to be a directed person. I'm very easy to go into my cave and just like, let's think. And then I like to write, and I love the writing, but this connection comes about when you have some space in your life, you have some uncertainty of where you're going, and you have a bit of a hunger for people and ideas. And I would say that doesn't happen to me too often, but when it happens, I feel very uncomfortable and I'm not quite sure what to do. This can go like for a period of time. I wouldn't say I feel lonely, but I feel this uncertainty and some, I guess, anxiety. And I would say, and so this happens to me periodically. I mean, the solution, which is maybe not the best solution, is try to get very busy again. So you try to bury your disconnection with work. And I think it's probably a normal thing for people in this time period, in our era, so to speak, that we bury our unhappy feelings with just more work. I'm not sure that's the best answer. I'm not sure it makes me more connected. I'm very fortunate I'm involved in some organizations, so they keep me busy, so that keeps me going. And there's things I do every week, but I don't go to the gym and punch anybody, not like you. But I would say there's certainly these periodically when I get to that moment, it does make you feel very it makes you uncomfortable and anxious when you get there.
And so the final question is, what advice would you give to help someone feel more connected? Work
Well, now
harder.
that you've asked me, the last time I was disconnected, it's not the best setup for the answer for this question, but I would say the easiest way to feel connected, I can give you the place. I mean, the easiest way, which is I'm very much thinking as a society as a whole, the only way we solve the problem of growing disconnection, loneliness, alienation, and all the downstream bad things these produce is we need as a society to neighborhood by neighborhood strengthen bonds. And that's the only way we reach everybody and we ensure every single person, there should be a goal of our societies, UK, US, and beyond, that everyone lives in a flourishing neighborhood. There's an economic component, but I'm most interested in the social component. That is healthy. If I'm an individual, and this is where some of the challenge comes, the easiest way to become connected is join some affinity group, join something and then that may not be local, that not be neighborhood. And most of us, we join professional groups, we join some affinity, we have a hobby, we have an interest, sometimes it's political. I think that's the easiest. I don't think that's the best. I don't think those are very deep relationships. The deeper, I would say, deeper are these more regular. Again, it doesn't have to be friends. Just having this web of relationships that if something is wrong, I can go out of my house, knock on my neighbor's door. I know my neighbors very well. They're inviting me constantly for a meal. I don't go so often, but they are very friendly. And I know them, and I can call on them to help me do this. And they do the same to me. Take my garbage out. I mean, I've done that for them. They're not here. Pick up my packages. They're not here. This is stuff that happens all the time. I can remember my neighbor. This is a funny story. My neighbor over there, who's a bit old, she drove out of her driveway, and she literally kept going across the street, across the lawn, and ran to this neighbor's backyard and hit a tree.
Oh no!
So that was hilarious, to be honest. But who's the one who had to call this neighbor and let them know what happened? And they were celebrating like their 50th anniversary, and they say, "We'll worry about it later." They were off in like an hour away from here. Whatever, they had a daughter or something that's another neighbor. So their daughter came and dealt with the problem. And someone called the police. You know, all the neighbors came around. We all worked together. So, but in terms of what I would suggest is, if you get to know your neighbors, if you join some neighborhood association, if you have this web of people that you just feel a sense of, we are in this together. This is our common destiny. We're here to help my neighbor when someone drives in their backyard. We're to help this neighbor when they need their kids to be driven to school. I mean, it's also you're giving, but you're also getting. And it's like willful interdependence. And it just changes your whole mindset, and you do not feel disconnection very often.
True. Okay, I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna make friends with my neighbors.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You'll have to send me a picture of you and your neighbor. I'm looking forward to it.
I have a friend in India, and he said the first thing that he does when he moves into a new place is buy sweets for all of his neighbors and take them around.
It's a culture. I lived in Japan, if we may go back.
Yeah.
And the rule in Japan, the custom is that when you move into a new place, it's not the neighbors who give something to you, which I think might be more common in the United States. Maybe it used to be. You buy a gift for your immediate neighbors as a way of, I wouldn't say it's like I've imposed, my new presence has changed something about the harmony of this place. So I'm here I mean, it's very Japanese that you apologize as a way of saying hello. It's the culture. I mean, I left Japan. I was still, my head was still going down when I was on the phone for many years because I was so used to bowing. But the point was, it's like creating a feeling of mutual obligation. I give to you, and then tomorrow you'll give to me. So a sense of mutual obligation you create by giving gifts to people. And so maybe if you took gifts to your neighbors, I don't know, again, it's English-speaking countries, we think very differently, but it's a nice way to start. Maybe you just organize a meal for a few people or what have you or whatever. But anyway, good luck. I hope you know your neighbors by the time we talk next time.
It's true. I definitely will. For a beer in Brixton, or where in the US are you based?
I'm right near Washington, so you
Okay.
have to find an excuse on your way back to Brazil.
Sounds good.